The morning they put Marin Voss out of the Holt house, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the frost had come down hard in the night, silvering the fence posts and the dead grass along the property road, and the roof of the barn. She had patched herself 2 summers before with lumber she had cut and carried without being asked. She stood at the gate with one hand on the horse's bridle and did not look back at the house. She did not need to look back. She had memorized every board and stone of that place across 4 years of marriage, the way a person memorizes a thing they know they will one day leave. She knew which step on the back porch took your weight wrong and threw you sideways if you weren't paying attention. She knew where the root cellar collected water in March, how the drainage ran wrong under the east foundation, because the original builder had graded the soil toward the house instead of away from it, a mistake that had been compounding quietly for 40 years, and that she had mentioned once and been told was not her concern. She knew that the kitchen garden, the one she had built from clay hardpan into something that actually produced, would go to weeds inside of 2 seasons without someone who understood it. The soil pH, the drainage patterns, the particular corner where the late frost always came 2 weeks after it had finished everywhere else. That knowledge would stay with her. The garden would not. She knew all of this, and she left it behind without a word, because words were not the instrument she intended to use. Aldous Holt watched from the parlor window. She could feel him watching the way you feel a cold draft through a wall you cannot see. He was 76 years old, and he had owned things for so long that the act of taking them from others had become as natural and unremarkable to him as breathing. He had given her 3 days to clear out. He had offered the horse which he framed as generosity, and which Marin understood as the minimum gesture required to keep the transaction looking civilized. A man who puts a woman out with nothing is a man who invites comment. A man who gives her a horse is a man who has been reasonable. He kept the house, the barn, the root cellar, the kitchen garden she had spent 4 years building into something worth having. The 40 acres of river bottom farmland that the Holt name had sat on since before Missouri was fully mapped. The spring house she had rechinked with lime mortar in the summer of 1887. The fence line she had walked every season post by post, testing for rot and lean, and the kind of slow failure that announces itself only after it has already happened. What he could not take was the 9 months she had spent thinking about what came next. She walked the horse north along the property road past the fence line into the tree line, and down the ravine path she had walked a dozen times in the past year. Always with a purpose, she could explain if anyone had asked. Always with the overhang in mind. Nobody asked. She had also taken 2 nights before she left 7 documents from the shelf in Aldous Holt's library, deed transfers going back to 1851 property tax records, a letter from the original land office establishing the Holt claim in 1849, and the 1847 survey map of the original property boundaries rolled carefully in a length of oilcloth and tucked beneath the sewing kit in her canvas pack. Not theft, retrieval. They were documents about land she had lived on and worked on for 4 years, and the principle she operated by was simple information relevant to her situation, was information she had the right to carry. She did not know yet precisely how she would use them. She knew she would use them. She walked north and did not look back. Marin Voss had come to the Holt property as a widow. Her first husband, a quiet carpenter named Thomas Voss, had died of a fever in the winter of 1884, leaving her a small house in Crossfield, a reputation for capable work and the particular freedom that comes to a woman when there is no longer anyone to account to. The freedom was not uncomplicated. It came wrapped in the practical difficulty of managing a household alone in a town where a woman without a husband was a category that people found easier to assign than to understand. But it was real, and she had come to value it more than she had expected to, in the way you value a thing more clearly once you have lived without it and then been given it back. She had not planned to remarry. She was 47 years old, and she had arrived at a version of her life that fit her the way a well-made garment fits, not flashy, not comfortable, in the soft way that makes you careless, but fitted correctly with room to move and nothing pulling wrong. She had her seamstress work, which she was good at in the specific way that matters, which is that her work held. Seams that did not pull buttonholes, that did not fray hems, that fell level after 50 washings. She had customers who trusted her, and neighbors who let her alone, and a kitchen garden of her own that she understood down to its soil composition and its drainage patterns, in the specific way the late afternoon light hit the bean rows in July. Then she met Prescott Holt at the dry goods counter in Crossfield in the spring of 1885, and Prescott Holt was a man who could be charming when he decided to be, and he decided to be for long enough to matter. She married him in June of 1885. She was 48 years old. She went into the marriage with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who has been married before and understands that the institution is not a feeling, but a set of arrangements, and that the arrangements need to be understood clearly before they are entered into. She understood that she was marrying into a family that had opinions about everything and would share those opinions without being asked. She understood that Aldous Holt considered his son's farm and his son's decisions to be extensions of his own property and his own judgment, and that Constance Holt, who had held the household together for 40 years through sheer organizational force, considered a new wife to be a variable that required monitoring. What she had not fully understood, or perhaps had understood and chosen to believe would improve with time, was that Prescott himself had never fully separated from his parents' accounting of things. He was 53 years old when they married, and he still deferred to Aldous on decisions about the land, about money, about the direction of the farm. He was not a cruel man. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had spent his entire life inside a system of authority that his father had built and maintained, and who had accommodated himself to that system so thoroughly that he could no longer clearly see where the system ended and his own judgment began. What Aldous thought of Marin from the beginning was that she was a widow from nowhere in particular, with no family land and no family name that carried weight in the county, and that his son had made a sentimental decision that a practical man would not have made. Aldous never said this directly. He did not need to. It was present in the way he spoke to her at the dinner table, in the way he walked through the farmhouse, as though she were a feature of it rather than a person in it, in the way he referred to her work in the kitchen garden as that project of yours, rather than acknowledging that the garden was producing more than it had in a decade. It was present in the way he and Constance discussed the farm's future in rooms they did not invite her into and came out of with decisions already made, presented to Prescott as conclusions rather than conversations, and presented to Marin as facts rather than decisions. Marin had learned across the 4 years of her marriage to keep her observations to herself. It was not a strategy she had designed. It was something older than strategy, something she had understood since she was a girl, which was that a woman in a house that is not entirely hers learns quickly what is worth saying aloud and what is worth keeping. The kitchen garden had been worth building. The barn roof had been worth repairing. The spring house had been worth rechinking. These were things she had done because they needed doing, and because doing them was the most direct argument available to her, more durable than any words she might have spoken. But she had not spoken the argument aloud. She had simply done the work and let the work speak, which is what you do when you understand that the person you are trying to convince is not listening to language. She kept a great deal. The money was the first thing she kept. She had 3 customers in Crossfield who had found her through the unmarked side entrance of the Holt farmhouse, women who needed work done well and did not need the Holt family to know they had come. Marin saw them after Prescott had gone out to the fields and before Constance made her twice-weekly visits. She charged fair prices. She did good work, and every dollar she made with her own hands she kept in the lining of her winter coat, which hung on a peg in the bedroom and which nobody in the Holt household had ever shown any interest in examining. By the autumn of 1889, there was $41 in that lining. It had taken 3 years to accumulate, and she had counted it so many times she could feel the weight of it without opening the seam. The second thing she kept was the knowledge of the ravine. She had found it in November of 1888, walking the north fence in the rain. There was a gap in the wire that the cattle were using, and she had gone out to find it because Prescott had mentioned it twice and done nothing about it, and the mention had the quality of a thing he expected someone else to address. She found the gap. She walked the fence line past it, checking the post for rot, the way she had learned to do from watching the farmhand they had had that first summer, a methodical older man named Burkett, who tested everything before he trusted it and who had the rare quality of teaching by example rather than instruction. At the north end of the fence, where the property dropped away into the drainage cut the Holts called the ravine, and had never walked into, she followed the wire down the slope because 2 of the posts at the bottom were leaning. The ravine was limestone cut deep with walls rising 12 feet on either side and a creek running along the floor low in November, clear and cold from the springs upstream. She was checking the bottom fence post when the rain intensified, and she stepped sideways under the overhang to get out of it. She stood there for 20 minutes. The overhang was 6 feet of horizontal limestone extending from the east wall, 8 feet above the ravine floor, running 18 feet along the cut before the ceiling dropped and the space narrowed. The clay bank behind it was bone dry, not damp, not merely sheltered. Bone dry with a dense workable surface that told her the overhang had been routing water away from that bank for longer than anyone alive could calculate. She pressed her fingers into the clay bank, dense and workable. She looked at the limestone ceiling above her, solid and flat-faced, where the geological fracture had left it. She looked at the creek running 6 feet in front of her and the ravine walls rising on either side. She thought, this is already a room. It simply has not been finished. She stood in the rain that was not touching her, and she looked at the space the way she had once looked at a length of fabric before she cut it, not seeing what it was, but what it could become if the right hands worked it correctly. The hands she was thinking of were her own. Then she walked back up the ravine path, fixed the fence post, and went back to the house to start supper. She did not mention the ravine to Prescott. She was not sure in that moment exactly why she had decided not to. Later, she would understand that some things once spoken aloud in the wrong house become subject to other people's opinions about them. And what Maren had found in that ravine felt like something she had found for herself alone, and what she found for herself, she had learned over 4 years of marriage to hold close until she knew exactly what she intended to do with it. She intended to do something with it. She spent the next 2 months walking the ravine on her fence, checking days, always with a stated reason for being in that part of the property, always with the overhang in her mind. She counted the dimensions by stepping them off, walking the length of the overhang heel to toe, and counting then the depth from the front edge to the clay bank, then estimating the height by the reach of her arms and the proportion of the limestone face above her head. She examined the clay bank with her fingers pressing into it to test the density, the same way she pressed a seam to test whether the thread would hold under tension. She watched where the creek rose after a rain and where it stayed low. She watched where the light came in above the ravine walls in the morning and where the shadow held longest in the afternoon. She watched the wind patterns, how the north wind moved through the cut and how the overhang above deflected it. She was not planning yet. She was learning. The planning came in January of 1889 when Prescott came home from a meeting with Aldous in a mood that told her without a word being exchanged that the accounting of the marriage had shifted in some way she was not going to be informed of directly. She had seen that mood before. It had preceded each of the decisions that had been made without her, the decision to expand the south field at the expense of the kitchen garden's access to water, the decision to sell the dairy cows. She had been managing the decision about the roof repair that had been deferred for another season because Aldous thought the expense premature. She understood what the mood meant. Not the specific decision that had been made, but the direction of it. She sat at the kitchen table that night after Prescott had gone to bed, and she drew a rectangle on the inside cover of her account book. She labeled the dimensions from her measurements: 18 feet wide, 11 feet deep, 8 feet at the front wall, dropping to 6.5 at the clay bank. She drew the front wall across the opening. She marked the doorway position left of center, where the 2 largest flat-faced stones she had identified in the ravine floor would serve as uprights. She marked the firebox position in the clay bank, set back 18 inches and 3 feet wide. She marked the shelf positions, 3 of them cut into the clay, above the firebox recess at heights that would serve for lanterns, supplies, and the account book she always kept within reach. She marked the floor. She wrote a list of materials beside the sketch: limestone rubble available in the ravine floor in sufficient quantity for a 5-course front wall at 18 inches thick. Clay available in the bank dense enough to cut cleanly within adze. Oak deadfall from the ridge above, already dry from the previous winter's ice storms, sufficient for a 2-layer subfloor. 1 iron firebox with removable grate to be purchased from a hardware store where nobody knew her face, in a town far enough from Crossfield that the purchase would not be connected to her name. 1 carpenter's adze currently hanging in the barn and constituting, in Maren's legal opinion, a gift from her first husband, Thomas Voss, and therefore her own property, regardless of what any deed said. She wrote a number at the bottom of the list: $11.20. That was what the iron firebox would cost at the hardware store in Millhaven, 20 miles east, which she knew, Because she had made a trip there in December under the stated purpose of purchasing thread and colors, the Crossfield dry goods did not stock and had spent 20 minutes in the hardware section pricing iron stoves while appearing to price lamp oil. Everything else the ravine would provide. She closed the account book and went to bed. She did not take the ads from the barn until the morning she left. She had read the book on farm construction in the winter of 1888, the same winter she found the ravine. It had been sitting in Aldous Holt's library for at least a decade without being opened, a thick practical volume with a cracked spine and diagrams of foundations, wall systems, drainage solutions, chimney construction, and subfloor methods. It had been placed on the shelf by someone who intended to read it and had not gotten around to it, which described most of the books in Aldous Holt's library, with the exception of the county land records he kept updated, and the financial ledgers he maintained himself in a hand so precise it looked typeset. She had taken it from the shelf one afternoon when she was alone in the house, and she had read it over 3 evenings sitting by the kitchen stove after Prescott was asleep, then replaced it on the shelf exactly as she had found it. She read it with the attention she gave to anything that might be useful, which was total and methodical. She did not skip the sections that seemed irrelevant. Relevance had a way of revealing itself later. What she took from that book she kept in her memory, which was more reliable than a shelf and considerably less likely to be examined by Aldous Holt. She learned that a dry stacked limestone wall built 18 inches thick, with flat-faced stones fitted carefully to each other, does not require mortar to hold. Gravity and careful placement are sufficient, provided each course is tested before the next is laid, and the stones are selected for their flat faces and consistent depth. She learned that a wall built this way settles into itself over time, becoming more fixed rather than less, because the weight above compresses the contact points below, and friction increases as the structure matures. She learned that you test each course by pressing on it with your body weight before you lay the next, and that a wall that does not wobble under that pressure will not wobble under weather. She learned that wood subfloor laid in 2 perpendicular layers insulates from ground, cold the same way log walls insulate from air cold by trapping still air between layers of material and using the thermal resistance of the material itself to slow the transfer of cold upward through the floor. She learned the specific method: first layer set directly on leveled earth perpendicular to the long axis of the room. Second layer set perpendicular to the first fitted close bark, removed faces smoothed. 2 layers of wood with an air gap between them over clay over limestone. The cold of the earth has to cross 3 distinct barriers to reach the sole of your foot. She learned about chimney draft, about the relationship between firebox size and flue diameter, about how a horizontal run of flue through dense clay cools and disperses smoke before it reaches open air. She learned that the draft in a horizontal flue is created by the temperature differential between the hot air in the firebox and the cooler air in the clay passage, and that the passage needs to be sealed well enough to prevent back pressure, but not so tight that it restricts the draw. She learned that clay cut cleanly and allowed to dry before use holds its shape reliably in a horizontal channel and does not require firing to remain stable as long as it stays dry. She retained all of it the way she retained a complicated pattern, not word for word, but structurally the logic of it held in her hands and her understanding, rather than on any page she might lose or that might be found. A pattern in the mind is a pattern that cannot be taken from you. She had learned this early and had applied it consistently. By the time Aldous Holt told Prescott that the marriage had not taken and that the property could not support a woman with no connection to it by blood or name, Maren Voss had been ready for the conversation for 9 months. She had the money, she had the plan, she had the knowledge. She had identified every material she would need and calculated what the one thing she could not find in the ravine would cost and gone and priced it. She had read the survey book from the library and committed its principles to memory. She had walked the ravine in every season and weather condition available to her across a year of careful attention. When Prescott came to her with the accounting of the marriage in September of 1889 and told her what his father had decided, she listened to him completely. She asked 2 questions, both practical. She accepted the 3 days. She accepted the horse. She did not cry, and she did not argue, and she did not make any of the speeches that the situation might have warranted, because speeches are for people who have not yet decided what they are going to do. Maren had decided. She spent the 3 days as she had planned. On the first day, she finished and delivered the 2 sewing orders she had outstanding through the side entrance of the farmhouse, telling her customers, through the intermediary of a note left at the dry goods counter, that she was relocating and would be in touch about new arrangements. On the second day, she packed carefully, taking nothing that was not demonstrably hers and leaving nothing that she would need. On the night of the second day, she went into Aldous Holt's library after the household was asleep, and she retrieved the 7 documents she had identified over the previous months as relevant to her situation. The deed transfers, the property records, the land office letter, and the 1847 survey map. She rolled them in oilcloth and placed them at the bottom of her canvas pack beneath the sewing kit. On the third day, she tied the horse above the ravine rim before Dawn loaded the saddlebags and walked out of the gate at 9 in the morning when she knew Aldous would be at his window. She tied the horse above the ravine rim on the morning of the third day in the early hours before the light was fully up. She had loaded the saddlebags at the farmhouse while it was still dark, the account book with its plans and lists. The money moved from the coat lining into a cloth pouch sewn into the waistband of her heaviest skirt. A bedroll. The canvas pack with her sewing kit, 2 changes of linen, and a small knife that had been Thomas Voss's and would remain hers. The ads wrapped in burlap and tied across the back of the saddle. The oilcloth wrapped documents at the bottom of everything underneath the sewing kit where they were protected and not easily visible. She left the coat. She did not need the coat anymore. The money was out of it. She climbed down the ravine path in the gray October light and stood under the overhang with her hands on her hips and looked at it the way she had looked at it every time she had come here across the past year. And then she looked at it differently because this time she was not learning. This time she was beginning. The front wall was the first problem. Without a front wall, the space was a shelter but not a structure. Open to the west wind, visible from the ravine path, offering nothing that a rock overhang in any drainage ditch could not offer. She needed a wall that closed the opening while leaving enough gap at the top for light and ventilation. She needed it to be built from what the ravine provided because she had $30 remaining after the firebox purchase, and she intended to spend as little of it as possible until she knew what the winter would require. The ravine floor was limestone rubble. The clay bank was dense and workable. She had an adze and she had time, which was the one resource the Holt family had not been able to take from her. She spent the first 3 days cutting and fitting limestone, not mortared, dry stacked in the way she had read about each stone chosen for its flat faces and fitted to the next without anything to hold it but gravity and careful placement. She worked in the early light when it was coldest and the stone was clearest to see breaking for the middle of the day, when the light in the ravine was flat and the cold had eased enough to make sustained work comfortable. She worked slowly and with more attention than speed, pressing each course before she laid the next the way the book had described, the way her hands already understood from years of work that required exactness over quickness. She sorted stones on the first day, walking the entire ravine floor and selecting for flat faces and consistent depth, carrying the best candidates back to the opening and stacking them in groups by size and face quality. It was an extra day of work that paid back in the 3 days of wall building that followed, because she was not stopping to hunt for the right stone while the course she was working on dried and settled. She had what she needed at hand, organized by what she would need it for, and she moved through the wall the way she moved through complicated sewing work, with a clear sequence and no improvisation. The wall rose across the 18-foot opening in 5 courses. She left the top 2 feet open under the rock ceiling for light and ventilation. She framed a doorway with 2 flat-faced stones set on end, their weight balanced so that the space between them was square and true. She had brought a plumb line in the sewing kit, a length of thread with a small steel thimble tied at the end, and she used it to check the uprights before she committed to the mortarless setting. When she pressed the completed wall on the third evening, it did not move. She pressed it at 3 points across its width, low, middle, and high, with her full weight behind her hands. Nothing. A wall 18 inches thick, dry stacked from limestone rubble, does not move. She stood back and looked at it in the last light of the afternoon and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not pride exactly. Pride suggests a performance for others. There was no one here. It was something more self-contained than pride. It was the specific satisfaction of work done correctly with your own hands, in a place where no one will ever tell you you've done it wrong. It was a feeling she recognized because she had felt it before in her work, in the particular moment when a difficult seam comes together under the needle exactly as you planned it, and the garment reveals itself as the thing it was always going to be. But this was larger than that. This was a wall. This would outlast her if she let it. The clay bank was the second material. She cut into it with the adze, not digging, but shaping the same distinction she had always made between a seamstress who cuts fabric and one who hacks at it. Cutting is precise. It removes exactly what needs to be removed and leaves the rest intact and stronger for having been properly worked. She cut shelves into the bank face for storage, 3 of them at heights she had measured against her own reach. The bottom shelf at waist height for heavy items, the middle shelf at shoulder height for the account book and the lantern, the top shelf at maximum reach for things she would not need daily. She cut niches for the lanterns, 2 of them positioned to throw light across the full width of the space without creating glare at eye level. She cut the firebox recess 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide into the back wall, giving it a flat face and squared corners and a floor that sloped slightly toward the front to draw the air correctly toward the firebox opening. The chimney was the engineering she thought hardest about. It was the problem she had spent the most time on in the planning stage, returning to it repeatedly over the months before she arrived, working through different solutions and rejecting them one by one. Smoke rising from a ravine would be visible from the property road, not necessarily identified as coming from a specific location. Smoke in autumn in the Ozark Hills was common enough, but visible in a way that invited looking, and looking was what she could not afford. She was on land the Holts believed they owned. The law regarding women living on former marital property without permission was not a thing she was prepared to test, and she did not intend to be found before she was ready to be found, which was a condition she reserved the right to define herself. She considered and rejected a vertical chimney rising through the clay bank to emerge above the ravine rim. Too tall, too structurally complicated, without masonry skill she did not have, and still potentially visible. She considered a small coal burn arrangement using only dried hardwood to minimize smoke, but even well-dried wood produces visible smoke in cold air, and she could not guarantee consistently cold-free combustion through a Missouri winter. She solved the chimney by not building one in the conventional sense. She carved a channel from the firebox, not vertical but horizontal, running back into the clay bank for 12 feet, angling upward at a shallow grade of approximately 1 inch per foot, then turning upward more steeply through the clay to emerge through a natural crack in the limestone above, behind a screen of old oak root that had grown along the ravine rim for 60 years. The channel took 3 days to cut and required working on her back in spaces too narrow to kneel, extending the adze in front of her and pulling cut clay back with her free hand. It was the hardest physical work she had done in the construction, harder than the wall building because it had to be done in a confined position with no leverage, and every inch of the 12-foot horizontal run had to be sealed on the sides and ceiling to prevent smoke from backing out into the room. She tested the draft before she installed the stove, burning a small handful of damp leaves in the firebox recess and watching where the smoke went. It hesitated for a moment the way draft always hesitates in a new channel while the temperature differential establishes itself, and then it pulled. Cleanly, consistently, without backing. It went into the horizontal channel and traveled 12 feet through the clay and turned upward and emerged through the limestone crack 60 feet above the ravine floor, where it dispersed through the oak roots and came out into open air already cooled and broken into nothing that anyone riding the property road would look at twice. In October, the creek was already putting morning mist into the air. What came out of the limestone above the oak roots was indistinguishable from that mist. She had spent $11.20 on the stove. The floor was the last structural element. The ravine bottom was limestone rubble over packed clay, cold underfoot, and uneven a surface that would become mud in any wet spell and remain cold regardless. She split oak logs she had identified along the ravine rim deadfall from the previous winter's ice storms, already dry and workable. She split them with the adze into planks, working slowly, splitting along the grain, the way she had learned to work with difficult fabric, following the direction of the material rather than fighting against it. The grain in well-dried oak is a reliable guide if you read it before you cut and do not rush the reading. She laid the first layer flat on the leveled clay set perpendicular to the front wall. The planks fitted as closely as the splitting would allow without gaps large enough to lose heat through. She laid the second layer perpendicular to the first fitting, the plank's close bark, removed faces smoothed with the adze edge, drawn flat along the grain, in long strokes that took off the high points without gouging the surface. When she laid her palm on the finished floor, it was solid and warm, wood over clay over limestone, 3 layers of material between her feet and the cold of the earth. The same principle that made log walls worked the same principle that made the overhang above her worth finishing into a room. Layers of material, each one slowing the transfer of cold until by the time it reached the surface you were standing on it was not cold anymore. It was the temperature of the layers above it, which was the temperature of the air in the room, which was the temperature she set with the stove. She stood in the finished space on the 14th day and turned around once looking at it the way she had looked at the ravine in November of 1888, seeing what it was and what it had become. The space was 11 feet deep and 18 feet wide and 8 feet tall, where the overhang met the front wall, dropping to 6.5 at the claybank. A plank floor fitted and smooth, 3 clay-cut shelves in the east wall, 2 lantern niches positioned for maximum coverage, a firebox recess in the back wall ready for the iron stove that was already wrapped in burlap in the horse's saddlebag. The front wall, 18 inches of dry stacked limestone closed against the west wind. The doorway framed with flat-faced stone uprights, square and true. The creek outside low and clear in the October dry season. The ravine walls on either side running with the pale roots of the oaks above the roots threading through the clay in pale ropes that had been finding their way through that wall since before the Holt family had arrived in Missouri. She had spent 17 days and $11.20. She moved in on the 17th of October. That night, lying on her bedroll on the ravine floor, the plank platform she intended to build was still 2 days away. She heard the frost come down. Not a sound exactly, but a stillness that replaced the small sound of the evening, and then a quality of cold in the air above the overhang that she could feel even inside the shelter she had built. She got up and lit a small fire in the iron stove, the first fire in the channel she had cut, and sat on the limestone rubble floor with her blanket across her shoulders and watched the draft pull the smoke back into the clay channel. The draft worked. She sat with that for a while. Not the fact of the draft, which she had calculated and tested and had reasonable confidence in, but the larger fact it represented. The plan she had made in January on a piece of paper in a kitchen that was not hers, in a house she had never fully been allowed to inhabit, sitting at a table in the dark, while a man she had married in good faith slept in the next room, making decisions without her. That plan was now a room. A real room with walls and a floor and a working fire and a ceiling of solid limestone that had been in place longer than any name she knew. The plan had worked not because she was lucky, not because circumstances had cooperated, but because she had understood the materials and the physics and the logistics, and because understanding was something she had been building for months, while appearing to do nothing more than walk fence lines in the rain. She thought about Aldous Holt standing at the parlor window that morning. She thought about the way he had watched her walk out of the gate with the particular satisfaction of a man who has resolved a problem. She thought about what it must look like to him from where he was standing, watching a woman with a horse and a bag walk north along the property road. He would have assumed she was heading for Crossfield, for the stage, for somewhere further on. He would have watched until she turned into the tree line, and then he would have gone back to whatever Aldous Holt did at 9 in the morning, and he would not have thought about her again with any seriousness, because people who have always owned things find it remarkably easy to believe that people without things simply go away. She was 80 feet from his north fence line. She thought about this for a moment. Then she banked the stove and lay down on her bedroll and pulled the blanket up, because sentiment was one thing and rest was another, and she had shelves to cut in the morning and a plank platform to build before the ground cold came up through the bedroll and made sleeping difficult. The work was not finished. It was never finished. That was the thing about a place you intended to live in rather than merely shelter in. It required ongoing attention, ongoing improvement, ongoing knowledge. That was not a burden. That was what living in a place actually meant. The clay walls of the room she had built held the warmth from the stove, the way good wool holds body heat, not extravagantly, not with excess, but steadily, the way a thing holds what it has been given when it has been properly made. She could feel it as she lay on the floor, the warmth coming back from the walls at her that had been going into them all evening, returning what had been invested. Outside, the creek ran cold and low over the limestone floor of the ravine, 80 feet from the Holt North fence under the rock and the oak roots and the stars that had come out behind the frost. Maren Voss went to sleep in a room that belonged to no deed and no account and no name, except her own. She had not decided yet how long she would stay, but she had decided in the way that matters, which is with her hands and her work rather than with words, that she would leave only when she was ready. And that readiness was a condition no one else would ever again have the authority to define. The first Tuesday she walked into Crossfield, she wore the gray wool coat she had bought in Millhaven, and she kept to the east side of the main street, where the feed store and the farrier's shop put enough foot traffic on the boardwalk that a woman walking alone did not constitute a noticeable thing. She had timed it carefully. Market day in Crossfield brought enough people in from the surrounding farms that the usual social geometry of a small town who notices whom, who speaks to whom, who reports back to whom, loosened slightly, not enough to be careless in, enough to move through without leaving a clear impression. She had been thinking about this problem since October, which was the kind of problem she liked, one that had a solution if you thought about it carefully enough and approached it from the right angle. The angle she had chosen was Cormac Fitch. Cormac Fitch ran the dry goods store on the north end of the main street, a low-ceilinged building that smelled of coffee and raw cotton and the particular dusty sweetness of dried goods stored in quantity. He was 61 years old, a compact and deliberate man who had operated the store for 30 years by the simple method of minding his own business with such consistency that the town had stopped expecting anything else from him. He was not unfriendly. He was not suspicious. He was not particularly curious. He was, in Maren's assessment, a man who had arrived at a settled understanding of what his responsibilities were and where they ended, and who found it easier to function when those boundaries were respected. She had chosen him for exactly that reason. She came in on a Tuesday in late October, 11 days after she had moved into the ravine, and she told him what she needed. Not where she was, not why. She told him she was available for sewing work, that she would collect orders on Tuesdays and deliver finished work on Fridays, and that orders could be left at his counter in a cloth bag with the customer's name written on it. She told him she would pay him 50 cents a month for the use of his counter as a collection point, which was enough to make the arrangement worth his while without being enough to make it worth discussing with anyone. Cormac Fitch listened to all of this with the expression of a man who is hearing nothing that particularly surprises him, which was the expression he wore for most things. Then he said, "Where should I send people who ask about the arrangement?" Maren said, "Tell them to leave their work at the counter." "That is sufficient," Cormac said. "And if they ask where you're located," Maren said, "tell them you don't know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That'll be accurate then." She said, "Yes, that'll be accurate." He nodded, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. She paid him the first 50 cents from the cloth pouch in her waistband and left a handwritten notice on his counter that said simply, "Sewing work taken. Inquire within, all work guaranteed." She had written it that morning on a page torn from the account book in the clean, deliberate hand she used for everything that was meant to be read by someone else. She walked back out of Crossfield the way she had come on the east side of the main street, and nobody looked at her twice. The women of Crossfield found her through the notice inside of 2 weeks. They came to Cormac's counter with cloth bags containing fabric and patterns, and more often than not, the kind of information that accumulates in a small town and requires somewhere private to be set down. A seamstress who operates through a dry goods counter with no fixed address is, by her very nature, a seamstress who cannot repeat what she hears. She has no social context, no neighbor relationships, no congregation membership, no market day conversations to carry information from one part of town to another. She is effectively sealed. This was not something Maren had calculated when she designed the arrangement. It was a consequence she recognized and accepted because what women brought to her along with their fabric was frequently the kind of information she found useful to understand even if she never used it directly. She learned which families were in financial difficulty. She learned which marriages were managing badly and in which specific ways. She learned that Prescott Holt had told people in Crossfield that his wife had gone to stay with family in Springfield, a version of events so close to what he wished were true that she suspected he had come to believe it himself. People who tell comfortable lies about uncomfortable situations have a way of convincing themselves over time, especially when no one contradicts them. She learned that Aldous Holt had gone to Cormac Fitch's store in the first week of November and asked in the direct way of a man accustomed to answers whether anyone had seen Maren Voss since she left the property. Cormac had told him that, as far as he knew, she had left the county. Aldous had bought tobacco, expressed no particular emotion, and left. Maren learned this on a Tuesday in mid-November, folded into the cloth bag, along with a request for alterations to a wool riding coat from the wife of one of the county commissioners. She sat with it for a moment on the ravine floor that evening, the lantern burning in its niche, the stove running low and steady, the clay walls giving back the warmth they had been collecting all day. She thought about Aldous Holt walking out of Cormac Fitch's store satisfied. She thought about the particular quality of that satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who has disposed of a problem and confirmed the disposal. She thought about where he imagined her to be at that moment. Springfield, perhaps, or further. Kansas City. Somewhere with family she did not have, or a situation she had constructed from nothing, the way people who have never had to construct anything from nothing imagine it is done. Then she picked up the riding coat and threaded her needle and went back to work because the coat needed to be ready by Friday, and the lining was more complicated than the woman had described. The collar attachment was not a standard construction. She needed to look at it carefully before she made the first cut. Outside, the creek ran low and cold between its banks. November taught her things about the space that she had not been able to learn in the building of it. Theory and practice are different countries, and moving between them requires adjustment. She learned that the overhang, which ran 18 feet along the east wall of the ravine, blocked the north wind with an efficiency she had estimated but not fully calculated. The north wind came off the ridge after the leaves dropped, straight and hard and cold, and it moved along the ravine in the way wind moves through a channel, gaining speed as it compressed between the walls. But the overhang redirected it upward over the front wall she had built, and what reached the interior of the space was a fraction of what moved through the ravine outside. She could hear the wind above her working through the oak roots and across the limestone, and inside the room it was still. Not warm. Still. Stillness was the beginning of warmth. She learned that the clay walls, once they had been warmed by the stove for 3 consecutive days, held that warmth for 16 hours after the fire was banked. The walls were not insulating in the way wood or plaster insulates by keeping cold out. They were storing heat the way a stone keeps the warmth of the afternoon sun into the evening, slowly releasing what they had taken and extending the effective warmth of each fire long past the fire itself. She had read about this in the farm construction book, The Thermal Mass of Dense Clay, but reading about a principle and living inside it are different experiences. Reading told her it would work. Living in it told her how completely. She learned that the creek, which she had worried about as a potential source of noise and dampness, was in fact a form of company. Its sound filled the ravine at a constant low pitch that she came to understand as the sound of the place being what it was, a continuous low note under everything else. The nights when it was quietest in the deep cold, when the surface edges froze and the water moved only in the center channel, were the nights that felt most like silence, which was a different thing than quiet. Quiet she could manage. Silence had a weight to it that required more effort. She made money. Between October and the end of January, she took in work from 9 women in Crossfield and 3 from the surrounding farms, work that came in cloth bags on Tuesdays and went back as finished goods on Fridays. She made $23 across those 3 months, which she added to the cloth pouch in her waistband and recorded in the account book she kept on the middle shelf of the east wall. The account book had 2 columns. The left column was money. The right column was time. Every Tuesday she recorded what she had earned. Every evening she recorded how many hours she had worked. At the bottom of each page she wrote a single line that was not accounting. The first line said, "Walls holding." The second draft, "Running clean." The third floor, "Dry through the rain." They were not diary entries. They were inspections. She had built a thing. She was monitoring whether it continued to work. February came with a cold that was different from November's cold. November's cold had a quality of warning in it, a preliminary that told you what was ahead, a cold that still had the memory of autumn in it and was by that fact navigable. February's cold was settled and indifferent, the cold of a season that has been what it is for long enough that it has stopped bothering to announce itself. It was simply present the way a fact is present, without drama and without negotiation. The creek dropped further running in a narrow channel between ice shelves that extended 2 feet from each bank. The stove ran for 6 hours in the morning, and Marin banked it through the afternoon, and the clay walls held the warmth until she relit it before dark. She had developed a rhythm with the stove, understanding its draft characteristics through daily use and adjusting her firing accordingly. More hardwood in the evening, which burned slower and held its coals longer, providing the sustained heat the clay walls needed to reach their full storage capacity. It was on a Thursday in the second week of February that she heard the horse on the path above. She heard it before she saw anything, the particular rhythm of a single horse moving slowly on frozen ground, the careful placing of hooves that told you the rider was not in a hurry and was paying attention to the footing. Not a working horse being pushed. A horse being ridden by someone who was also paying attention. She set her sewing down on the plank floor, and she did not move. Through the gap at the top of the front wall between the limestone and the rock ceiling, she could see a strip of the ravine rim above. The light was flat and gray, the kind of February light that makes everything look equally distant and removes the shadows that give you depth and dimension and the sense of how far away things are. She watched the strip of sky at the top of the wall and she waited. The horse stopped. She could hear it clearly now, the shift of weight, the breath of an animal standing still on cold ground. Directly above, on the path that ran along the north edge of the Holt property, 6 feet back from the ravine rim, the path she had walked a dozen times herself in the past year. She recognized the rhythm of that stillness. She had lived 4 years in a house with Prescott Holt, and she knew the specific quality of his pauses, the way he stopped and stood when he was looking at something he considered his. There was a particular quality of ownership in how he occupied space when he was assessing property, a rooted stillness that was different from simply standing still, and she heard it now in the way his horse stood and breathed. She moved back against the clay bank. Not quickly. There was no quick movement that would not make a sound in a space this size, and sound in a limestone ravine carries upward with a clarity that open air does not provide. She moved the way she moved when she was working in a tight corner of a seam, slowly with complete attention to every point of contact between herself and the surfaces around her. She moved the way she had learned to move in the 4 years of living in a house where she was always being assessed. She put her hand on the adze where it rested against the east wall. She was not sure what she intended to do with it. She was not sure she intended to do anything with it. But the hand wanted something solid, and the adze was there, and there is a difference between fear and readiness. And what she felt in that moment was readiness, the specific quality of attention that comes when you are prepared for whatever the next moment requires and are not yet certain what that will be. Prescott Holt stood on the path above the ravine for 3 minutes. She counted them by the sound of his horse breathing. 3 minutes is a long time to stand still in February air without a particular reason. It is long enough to make a decision. It is long enough to change your mind about a decision and make a different one. It is long enough to dismount and look more carefully at something that has caught your attention. He turned the horse and rode back down the path toward the south. Marin did not move for another 5 minutes after the sound of the hooves faded. She stood against the clay bank with her hand on the adze, and she listened to the silence of the ravine. After the horse sounds were gone, the creek running thin under its ice, the oak roots settling in the cold above, and she waited until she was certain the silence was complete and not merely a pause. Then she let out a breath she had not known she was holding and looked at the front wall. The limestone was the same color as the ravine walls behind it, not similar. The same because she had chosen stones from the ravine floor that matched the color and texture of the exposed limestone on the east wall, which was where the overhang came from. In the flat February white from the rim above, looking down at an angle into a cut that was 12 feet deep and filled with shadow, you would see stone walls and a creek, and the pale tangle of oak roots coming down through the clay. You would see a drainage cut. You would see exactly what the Holts had always seen when they looked at the North Ravine, which was nothing worth looking at. Nothing that merited the effort of climbing down. She had not built a hiding place. She had built a room that looked from the outside exactly like the landscape it was part of. The distinction mattered. A hiding place is a reaction to a threat. A room that belongs to its landscape is a different thing entirely. It is a construction that has been thought through carefully enough that it requires no concealment because it does not announce itself. She understood something in that moment that she had known technically, but not yet fully felt she was not surviving here despite the Holts. She was surviving here because she understood the land they had owned for 40 years better than they did. She had walked every foot of this property. She had tested the soil, mapped the drainage, watched the light move across the ridge through all 4 seasons. She had read the farm construction book they had never opened and used it to build something in a drainage cut they had never walked into. She had listened to Burkett, the farmhand, and learned from watching how he worked. She had paid attention to everything that was happening around her for 4 years, while the people around her were paying attention to other things. They had owned this land for 40 years. They did not know it the way she knew it. That was not luck. That was the result of paying attention for 4 years while they were not paying attention to her. Spring came in March and the creek rose with the snow melt from the ridge. Marin spent 3 days moving everything she could move to the back of the space, raising the lantern and the account book and the sewing supplies to the upper shelves, moving the stove as far back toward the clay bank as the flue connection allowed. The water came up 6 inches above its February level and lapped against the first course of the front wall without breaching it and then receded over 4 days as the melt slowed. The floor planks were damp on the underside, but not warped. The wall held without shifting. The clay bank, which she had worried about through the whole of the winter, showed no sign of water intrusion. The overhang had been routing water away from that bank for long enough that the drainage was deeply established in the limestone above, and even the high spring creek did not reach the base of the clay wall. She recorded this in the account book. Right-hand column. One-line walls held through the melt. Inspection complete. She planted a kitchen garden in April on the flat ground at the south end of the ravine, where the creek deposited the fine silt that made the best soil and where the ravine walls opened enough to let in 4 hours of afternoon sun. She had walked the ravine enough to know exactly where those hours of sun fell and how they moved through the seasons. The garden was small. It produced things she could actually use: onions, turnips, a row of beans, some parsley that came back on its own from seed she scattered early and largely forgot about until June. She was not sentimental about it the way she had been about the kitchen garden at the Holt farm. That garden had been an argument. She was making a demonstration of competence and value, a claim staked in the language of productivity. This one was just food. She needed it. She grew it. That was all. The summer of 1890 was dry. The creek dropped to its lowest level she had seen, running clear and thin between the stones, finding the center of its channel and staying there. She found the spring that fed it by walking upstream in July, until she found where the water came out of the hillside in a steady seep through a crack in the limestone, cold and clean, regardless of what the weather above was doing. She built a small stone collection pool around the seep, not elaborate, just 4 flat rocks arranged to hold 8 inches of water before it ran over into the creek. She could fill a bucket from it without walking more than 200 feet from the room. Cold, clean, independent of the creek's seasonal variations. Another problem solved. Another element of the place understood and made to work. She made $31 that summer. She had stopped counting the weeks. Aldous Holt died in June of 1891. She heard the church bell from the ravine in the early morning, the slow measured tolling that meant someone who mattered to the town, not the quick rolling of the bell that announced a fire or an emergency, but the deliberate count that marked a death and asked the town to stop for a moment and acknowledge it. She counted the rings. She did not know immediately whose death it was announcing, but she found out on Tuesday when she came into the edge of Crossfield, and the particular quality of the town's activity told her. The black on the door of the Crossfield Bank, where Aldous had kept his accounts for 40 years. The gathering outside the courthouse. The specific combination of solemnity and relief that marks the passing of a powerful man who has been powerful for a very long time. She stood on the east side of the main street for a moment and felt something that was not grief and was not satisfaction and was not quite either of the things she might have expected to feel after 4 years of living within the radius of Aldous Holt's authority. It was closer to the feeling of a draft that has been blowing at your back for a long time stopping. Not warmth, not cold, just the absence of a pressure that had been so constant you had stopped noticing it as a separate thing from the atmosphere itself. You notice it only when it stops. You feel the absence, and in feeling the absence, you understand for the first time how present it had been. She collected her Tuesday orders from Cormac's counter and walked back out of town and thought the whole way back through the tree line and down the ravine path about what Aldous Holt's death meant for the land. Her sister Harriet had written twice from Springfield, in Springfield that year, once in January, once in April, offering the spare room in her house and the uncomplicated company of a household that had no particular opinion about Marin's choices. Harriet was 55 years old, married to a steady man who ran a dry goods operation of his own, and she had the quality of someone who offered help without conditions attached to it. Marin had not written back, not because she was ungrateful and not because the offer was not real, because she had nothing to report that Harriet would understand without a longer explanation than Marin was prepared to give, and because the explanation would have raised questions she was not yet ready to answer, including the central one, which was when she was coming. She did not know when she was coming. She knew what Aldous Holt's death meant for the land. It meant Prescott would decide. And Prescott, without his father's voice in his ear, establishing what the right decision was, before Prescott had time to form an opinion of his own, was not a man who held things. He was a man who managed things until managing became inconvenient and then resolved the inconvenience through the most efficient means available, which in his case was almost always financial. He would sell. The question was when and to whom. She gave it 3 months. It was a considered estimate based on 4 years of watching how Prescott Holt made decisions. It took Prescott Holt exactly 3 months. The survey crew arrived on the 14th of September, 3 men with a transit instrument and a measuring chain, and Myron watched them from the ravine rim for 2 full hours before she understood what they were doing, and another hour before she understood what it meant in full. She was not above the section of the ravine where she had built. She was further north in the tree line above the ridge where she had a clear line of sight to the south field and the house and the barn and the property road without being visible herself. They were walking the field boundaries. The creek line, the property road. They were measuring everything that constituted the productive surface of the Holt farm, the 40 acres of river bottom, the barn, the house, the kitchen garden which had gone to weeds exactly as she had known it would, inside 2 seasons, without someone who understood its particular requirements. They did not come near the North Ravine. She watched one of them, a young man maybe 20 years old, with the energy of someone who has not yet learned to conserve himself on long working days, stop at the edge of the drainage cut and look down. He stood there for a moment with one hand shading his eyes against the afternoon light. She could see from where she was that he was looking down into the ravine, scanning the cut from the rim, in the way a young person scans an unfamiliar feature of the landscape with more curiosity than purpose. He started down the slope. Marin was already moving, not toward him, not away, down the ridge back toward the space, taking the path she had worn into the ravine wall over 2 years of daily use, moving as quickly as she could move on that surface without making noise that would carry. She reached the space before he had gotten more than 6 feet down the far slope. She pulled the canvas door panel across the doorway, opening a piece of heavy canvas she had sewn to hang across the entrance against the wind, the same color as the limestone of the front wall, and stood against the clay wall in the back of the space with her hand on the adze, and she waited. She heard his boots on the limestone above, the scrape of a foothold being tested, the sound of someone working their way down a slope they were not certain about, feeling each step before committing to it. He was 6 feet down a 12-foot slope. He would be starting to see the bottom of the ravine, starting to see the creek in the wools and the overhang. She heard his name called from above, sharp and impatient, the voice of a man behind the schedule who has no interest in unscheduled side expeditions. The boots stopped. A pause. Then the scrape of someone reversing direction, climbing back up, the sounds getting fainter with each step and then gone. She stood in the back of the space for a long hour after they left. Not because she was afraid they would come back, because she had something to think about and she needed the stillness to think it through properly. The young man had looked down and started climbing before he had anything specific to look at. He had been curious about the drainage cut the way any observant person is curious about a feature of the land that sits at the edge of what they are supposed to be measuring. He had not been looking for her. He had been looking because looking is what a certain kind of person does when they encounter an edge, a boundary, a thing that sits just outside the defined territory. and he had come 6 feet down a 12-foot slope before a circumstance pulled him back. Marin stood in the shadow of the clay bank, and she turned this over in her mind. Not the near discovery which she had managed and which had not amounted to anything, but the question it raised, the question that the survey crew's presence on the land had made unavoidable. She had built this place with a specific intention, clear and practical: survive the winter, save money, put enough distance between herself and the legal and social situation she was in that she could leave on her own terms when she was ready. That had been the plan she had drawn in January of 1889. That was the plan she had executed with an ads in $41 and the knowledge from a book no one else had bothered to read. But it was now September of 1891. She had been here for 2 years. She had enough money saved that the trips to Crossfield had become, in the accounting of risk versus necessity, more exposure than they were worth. She had built something that worked not in the provisional way of something designed to last a season, but in the solid, settled way of something that had been tested by weather and time and had passed both tests. The clay walls and the plank floor and the horizontal chimney that had never once betrayed her, the kitchen garden and the water collection pools, and the seamstress arrangement with Cormac that had functioned for 2 years without requiring any explanation of itself. She had built a life, not a temporary shelter from which a better life was visible on the other side of the difficulty. A life with a working infrastructure, a reliable income method, a thorough knowledge of its physical setting, and a daily routine that fit the place it was conducted in. The question the survey crew had raised was not whether she would be discovered. She had managed that with an hour to spare. The question was what she was doing here, what she intended, and whether the answer she had given herself in January of 1889 was still the true answer in September of 1891. She did not yet know. She sat down on the plank floor in the dark of the space she had built, and she listened to the creek running outside, and she turned the question over without forcing it toward a conclusion, because forcing questions toward conclusions before they are ready produces answers that do not last. The land sold in October. She learned this from the notice posted at the Crossfield courthouse, which she read from across the street through the store window of the feed merchant while appearing to examine a display of seed catalogs. Prescott Holt had sold all 40 acres and the improvements to a grain merchant from St. Louis named Silas Burwell, who had purchased 3 other river bottom properties in the county that year, and who was, by all available evidence, assembling productive farmland, the way a careful and unsentimental man assembles anything of value methodically, without attachment, and with a clear understanding of what he was buying and what he was not. Silas Burwell, as far as Marin could determine, had no particular interest in the north edge of the property or in the drainage cut labeled on the survey documents as non-arable. His interest was the river bottom, the cropland, the barn, the house, the things that produced income when managed correctly, the things that appeared on the survey chain, in the deed, in the tax assessment. She thought about this for a long time. Then in November, on what she intended to be her final Tuesday run to Crossfield for the season, she arrived at the edge of the main street and stopped before she crossed. A woman she recognized from the Methodist congregation was standing at Cormac's counter. Not with a cloth bag, without a cloth bag. She was talking to Cormac with the focused attention of someone who has come for a specific piece of information rather than a specific piece of work. Her hands were empty, and her posture was the posture of inquiry, leaning slightly forward, maintaining eye contact, asking follow-up questions. Marin stood in the shadow of the feed store across the street for 20 minutes and watched. Cormac said whatever he said. The woman asked something else. Cormac responded. The woman stood for another moment, looked around the store, as though what she was looking for might be visible from where she stood if she looked in the right direction, and then left. Marin watched her go. Then she looked at Cormac's counter, at the cloth bags sitting there with her customers' names written on them, and she did the calculation she had been putting off for several months. The arrangement had worked because it was invisible. It was invisible because it was simple, and because Cormac asked no questions, and because her customers received good work reliably without knowing where it came from, and had no particular reason to push on the question of her location. But a woman from the Methodist congregation asking specific questions about a seamstress who had no address was not invisible. That was the beginning of a thread being pulled, and a thread that begins to be pulled does not stop on its own. In Myron's experience with fabric and with people, a thread that has been found and started never stops until you cut it deliberately, or it runs all the way to the end. She turned around and walked back up the east side of the street the way she had come, without the orders, without speaking to Cormac, without crossing the street at all. She did not go back. It was the last time she walked into Crossfield. The cloth bags sat on Cormac's counter until he collected them at the end of the day, puzzled but unworried, and moved them to the shelf behind the register where he had always kept unclaimed goods. He did not send a message. He did not ask around. He had agreed to know nothing, and he was very good at that agreement. It was in its way one of the most useful qualities a person could have, and she had chosen him for it. Marin walked back to the ravine in the November air through the tree line and down the path and under the overhang and into the room she had built, and she sat on the plank floor with her sewing in her lap and did not pick it up for a long time. She had $39 in the pouch in her waistband. She had food in the root niche she had cut in the clay bank in the spring. She had wood along the ravine rim enough to last the winter without another cutting trip. She had the water collection pools running clean. She had everything she needed to function for as long as she needed to function. What she did not have for the first time since October of 1889 was a reason to go to Crossfield on Tuesdays. The winter of 1891 came down hard and early, and she sat with it. No orders, no accounts, no Tuesdays. Just the ravine and the stove and the creek and the account book on the middle shelf, which she picked up one evening in December and opened to the right-hand column where she had been writing her inspection notes for 2 years. She looked at the last line she had written, which was from September 3-word survey crew. Ravine unchecked, holding. She turned to a blank page. She picked up her pencil. She wrote, "I am not hiding from them anymore. I am choosing to stay. That is a difference that matters, and I am the only one who needs to understand it." She closed the book and put it back on the shelf and banked the stove and went to sleep. Outside, the first serious snow of the season was coming down through the oak roots above the ravine, settling on the limestone walls of the cut covering the path and the fence line, and the 40 acres of Holt River bottom that was now Burwell River bottom, covering everything equally as it always does, without distinction and without preference. 80 feet from the north fence. 3 winters in. Still here. The winter of 1891 was the longest she had known. Not in days. The days ran the same as any winter, short and gray, and folding into each other with the particular monotony of a season that has decided it will last as long as it lasts and sees no reason to announce its intentions. But in the quality of the time inside those days, the texture of the hours, the weight of the silence that settled into the ravine after the creek froze along its edges, and the oak roots above went still, it was longer than either of the 2 winters before it. The first winter had been construction. There had always been something to solve, something to test, something to build or adjust or improve. The second winter had been the seamstress work, the rhythm of orders and deliveries, and the Tuesday walks into Crossfield, which had imposed a structure on the week that kept the days from running into each other without distinction. This winter had neither. She woke in the mornings and she lit the stove and she ate and she worked through whatever needed working through, and then the afternoon light went flat and gray above the ravine walls and she lit the lantern, and the evening came down and she went to sleep. Then she woke and did it again. The creek ran thin between its ice shelves, finding the center of its channel and moving there with the economy of water that has no surplus to spend. The oaks on the rim were bare, and the roots that threaded down through the ravine walls were dark with cold, the moisture in them frozen and contracted, and the sky when she went up to cut wood or to look at the weather was the pale, featureless white of a sky that is forgotten. It was ever any other color. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity was not an instrument she had much use for. It required a belief that your situation was someone else's responsibility, and she had stopped believing that a long time ago, possibly before she ever started. But she took account of what she was, which was a 54-year-old woman living alone in a limestone ravine in the Ozark Hills in the winter of 1891 with no particular obligation to be anywhere, and no particular person who knew she was here, and she allowed herself to sit with the full weight of that accounting without adjusting it to seem more manageable than it was. It was manageable. That was the honest conclusion. Not comfortable in the way that comfort is usually described. Not warm and social and full of the texture of other people's presence and conversation. in the ordinary friction of living alongside others, but manageable in the deeper sense of the word, which is that she could carry it and still function, still think clearly, still plan and assess and execute. The winter was long and she was alone in it, and those were facts, and facts were what she worked with. She began writing in the account book, not the inspection notes. Those continued in the right column, brief and factual, as they had always been: floor dry, stove clean, clay bank holding, draft running clear. But she opened the left column where the money figures had always gone, and she wrote something that was not a number. She wrote the difference between hiding and choosing is the location of the decision. When I came here, I was responding to what they did. I am still here because I decided to be. Nobody drove me further in. Nobody is keeping me here. I stayed because this is the first place I have lived where every element was built by my own hands, to my own specification. And I find I am not done with that yet. She looked at what she had written for a moment, the words sitting in the left column, where the money had been, where the accounting of her labor had been recorded for 2 years. Then she turned the page and went back to the right column and wrote stove draft running clean. Clay bank dry through the cold snap. Floor holding. That was December. She continued in this way through January and into February. Inspection in the right column. Thinking in the left. The two kinds of writing did not interfere with each other. They were different modes of attention applied to different aspects of the same situation. The same way she could assess the construction of a garment and the quality of the fabric and the wishes of the woman wearing it all in the same moment, each assessment separate and distinct and not confused with the others. She wrote in the left column about the property, about what she knew of the 1847 survey that she had read in the Holt Library before she took it, about the boundary lines as she understood them, about the legal language she had been turning over in her mind since the summer when she had first begun to think systematically about what her situation actually was rather than what it felt like. She did not yet have all the pieces, but she was beginning to see the shape of something. Cormac Fitch died on a Thursday in March of 1892. She heard about it the way she heard most things now, at a remove and through careful inference. She went into the eastern edge of Crossfield once a month, not to the main street, but to the area near the mill where the farm laborers gathered on Friday mornings, and where information moved freely and without the social management that characterized the main street's conversations. She stood near enough to listen and far enough to be unremarkable, a middle-aged woman in a gray coat stopping at the edge of a gathering on her way somewhere else. She heard that Cormac Fitch had gone quietly in his sleep, which was the kind of death people described with a mixture of relief and envy. Relief that it was not violent, or prolonged envy that it was so clean. She heard that his wife Winifred was sorting through the store's papers and settling the accounts. She heard that there was some question about unclaimed goods and payments. She did not go closer. 3 weeks later, reading the Crossfield paper that she had taken from the stack outside the mill office, she found the notice. It was small, 2 column inches below the courthouse announcements, placed where the legal notices always went, where people looked when they had reason to and otherwise did not. Winifred Fitch, settling the accounts of the late Cormac Fitch, was seeking to contact a Mavos regarding unclaimed payments totaling $61 held at Fitch Dry Goods since the autumn of 1891. Persons with information were asked to contact the store directly. Marin sat on a flat limestone rock at the south end of the ravine where the morning sun reached the floor for 2 hours in early spring, and she read the notice twice. Then she folded the paper and set it on her knee and looked at the creek. $61. 2 years of work delivered reliably, collected reliably, and then uncollected for the last 18 months, when she had decided that the exposure of the Tuesday trips had become more costly than the income they produced. The money was real and it was hers in every sense that mattered, and she had decided with the same deliberateness she applied to every decision she made in this ravine to leave it where it was. She had not forgotten it. You do not forget $61. She had chosen not to collect it, which is a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered to her the way precision always mattered to her in everything she built or cut or stitched. The notice in the paper was Winifred Fitch doing what any honest woman does when she finds money that belongs to someone else, making a reasonable effort to return it. It was not a threat, and it was not a trap, and it required nothing from Marin that Marin was willing to provide. She folded the paper again and carried it back to the ravine and put it on the upper shelf and went back to work. The $61 remained in Crossfield. Marin had $104 in the pouch in her waistband, accumulated over 3 years of work and careful spending, and she did not need $61 more badly enough to give anyone in Crossfield a reason to ask questions that had no satisfactory answer available to them. This too she wrote in the account book. Not the number, the reason. She wrote, "I left the money because collecting it would have required explaining myself to people who do not have the right to an explanation. I have earned enough. I have kept enough. The rest is the cost of being where I chose to be, and I pay it without resentment." The summer of 1892 was the first summer she allowed herself to learn the ravine entirely without purpose imposed from outside, without the seamstress work governing her schedule, without the Tuesday trips to Crossfield imposing a shape on the week. She had always been learning it since the first November she had walked down into it in the rain and stood under the overhang. But that learning had always been in service of something specific: building, maintaining, concealing, sustaining. This summer she walked it without a project in mind, simply looking with the full and unencumbered attention of someone who is no longer managing a crisis. She walked the full length of the ravine from the point where it opened into the wider creek valley half a mile south to where it narrowed to nothing against the ridge face half a mile north. She mapped it in the account book with a pencil sketch, working from observation and her own stepped-off measurements, a map that she understood would be more accurate than the survey crew's notes had been because she had walked every foot of it and they had walked none of it. She found 2 other overhangs, smaller than the one she had built, into both on the east wall, both with the same dry clay banks behind them that told her the limestone above had been routing water away from those walls for as long as it had been routing it away from hers. She noted their dimensions in the account book, not for any immediate purpose, because she was learning the place thoroughly. She found a section of the north wall where a spring seeped through the limestone at a height of 4 feet, trickling down the wall face and disappearing into the ravine floor. The seep was small but consistent, and she built a collection channel from flat stones sealed with clay and diverted it into a second storage pool 20 feet upstream from her existing one. She now had 2 reliable water sources within the ravine itself, both cold, both clean, both independent of the creek's seasonal variations. 2 is better than 1 when weather is unpredictable and you are living alone without anyone who will notice if a supply fails. She found on the ridge above the north end of the ravine a stand of hickory that had not been harvested since before the Holt family arrived in the county. The trees produced a quantity of nuts in September, sufficient to carry her through a significant portion of the winter term without touching her other stores. And she spent 3 days in early October gathering and shelling them and storing them in the clay niches she had cut in the lower sections of the bank, where the temperature was most consistent. She mapped the sun patterns through the full year, noting in the account book exactly how many hours of direct light reached different sections of the kitchen garden in each month. This told her precisely what she could grow where and when, and she adjusted the garden layout accordingly, moving the beans to the south end where they got 6 hours in July, and the root vegetables to the north end, where the cooler soil held moisture longer through the dry August. The garden produced more that autumn than it had in either of the 2 previous years. Knowledge applied correctly compounds. She was not preparing to leave. She was not preparing to stay. She was learning the place she lived with the full and unhurried attention it deserved, the attention she had always had, to manage carefully before allocating it between what was necessary and what was urgent, never having quite enough left over for the pure knowledge that has no immediate application. Otis Crane, who managed properties for Silas Burwell and who was methodical and competent at it, arrived in June and again in October. She watched him from the ravine rim both times. He walked the buildings, the fields, the fence lines. He wrote in his notebook with the concentrated attention of someone who is being paid to notice things and takes that responsibility seriously. He wrote out. He did not come near the North Ravine. She watched him go the second time in October, and she felt nothing in particular. Not the relief she had felt in the first winter when anyone passed near the ravine without discovering it. Not the vigilance that had kept her hand on the adze through those early months. Just a calm, observational attention, the attention you give to something that is present and relevant and not a threat. She had stopped being afraid of being found some time ago. What she felt now, watching Otis Crane ride south along the property road, was closer to the particular clarity that comes when you understand your situation completely and are no longer managing your reaction to it. She went back down into the ravine and sat on the plank floor and opened the account book. She had been doing something for several months that had begun as inspection notes and had become something else. She was writing about the law. She had found the reference in the summer of 1892 in a copy of the Missouri Revised Statutes that she had borrowed without returning from the waiting area of the county land office in Millhaven, where she had gone ostensibly to examine property transfer records and had spent 3 hours reading everything accessible on the reference shelf while the clerk processed a complicated estate matter in the back room. The clerk had not minded. Reference materials in government waiting rooms exist to be read by people waiting, and she had the appearance of someone who had been waiting for a long time and intended to make use of it. She had not known specifically what she was looking for. She had been looking the way she always looked, the way she had looked at the farm construction book in Aldous Holt's library, and the way she had looked at every document she had ever handled that might contain something useful. Reading thoroughly, because thoroughness is a habit, and habits do not stop being valuable when you lack a specific application for them. Relevance reveals itself. You cannot know in advance what you will need. The Homestead Act of 1862 had been in operation for 30 years by the time she read it in the summer of 1892. She had a general understanding of it, the understanding any person has of a significant law that has shaped the landscape they live in without ever having had personal occasion to apply it. A person could claim unsettled land by living on it and improving it for 5 years and then paying a small fee to register the claim. What she read in the Missouri Revised Statutes and then confirmed in the federal statute language reprinted in the appendix was more specific. Any citizen of the United States who was the head of a household or who was 21 years of age or older and single was eligible to file a homestead claim. The statute listed explicitly among those eligible widows and women who were unmarried or who had been legally separated from their husbands and were maintaining themselves independently. Maren Voss was 54 years old, legally separated from Prescott Holt and maintaining herself independently. She had been doing so for 3 years on a piece of ground she could describe precisely in legal boundary notation and had improved substantially by any measure the statute recognized. She set the statute down and looked at the wall of the county land office waiting room for a long time. Then she thought about the survey. The survey conducted in September of 1891, when Prescott sold the farm to Silas Burwell, whose field notes she had read carefully during the required public posting period at the Crossfield Courthouse while appearing to read the adjacent notice about road maintenance assessments. The survey notes had described the north drainage cut as non-arable. They had drawn the property boundary along the creek line and the fence line. The hinge point, the corner where the north fence met the east boundary, had been placed at the top of the ravine rim, not at the bottom. The ravine floor was not included in the measured acreage. The survey notes did not claim it was outside the whole property. They simply did not address it. It was drainage non-arable, outside the scope of a survey chain measuring arable farmland. She came back to Millhaven 2 weeks later with the specific question that had been developing across those 2 weeks into something clear and answerable. She asked the clerk directly about the original survey of the Holt land, the 1847 survey that had first established the property boundaries when the land was originally claimed. The clerk was a methodical young man who found what she asked for without particular curiosity about why she wanted it. Record requests were record requests. His job was to provide access to public records, which this was. The original 1847 survey was based on the creek line and the high ground to the north. It had been conducted in summer when the creek ran high enough to serve as a clear and measurable boundary, and the surveyor had walked the creek and the ridge and had not walked the drainage cut between them. The drainage cut was non-arable. It was not farmland. It was not logged. It was not grazed. It produced nothing of commercial value and therefore had never been considered worth the time of a survey chain. It did not appear on the 1847 survey document. It did not appear on the 1891 survey document. It had never been legally incorporated into any recorded deed held by any party. Maren sat in the county land office in Millhaven and looked at the 1847 survey document and the 1891 survey document side by side, and she felt something move through her that was not surprise because she had been building toward this conclusion methodically for 2 weeks And surprise was not available to a person who had been thinking carefully about something for that long. And not satisfaction, because satisfaction implies the work is finished, and it was not finished yet. It was the feeling of a difficult seam that is finally under the needle and after several attempts at the correct angle come together the way it was supposed to come together. The feeling of a thing confirming itself. She thanked the clerk. She left. She walked back to where she had tied the horse and stood with her hand on the bridle for a moment in the October air, letting the full facts settle into its proper place in her understanding. The ravine she had been living in for 3 years had never been legally claimed by anyone. Not the Holts who had owned the surrounding land for 40 years and had walked the ravine never. Not Silas Burwell who had purchased that land and surveyed it and was managing it for crop production through Otis Crane's twice-yearly inspections. It was a piece of ground that sat in the survey record as a blank space, a drainage feature, a line the chain had never crossed. The Homestead Act allowed her to file on unclaimed ground. She had lived on this particular piece of unclaimed ground for 3 years. She had built a structure on it, a habitable structure with a working fire and a weatherproof roof and a dry floor. She had cultivated a garden on it. She had installed water management works on it. She had improved it in the legal meaning of that word, as defined in the statute considerably more than the statute required. She had been living on her own property without knowing it. That was not quite right. She corrected herself on the ride back through the Ozark Hills, the October light coming through the hardwoods. In long gold angles, the horse steady under her on the limestone road. She had been living on ground that could become her property. The distinction required one more step. She needed the Holt documents. She had taken them on the morning she left the Holt property 2 nights before the formal departure, when the household was asleep and the library was dark. Not as theft, as retrieval. They were documents about land she had lived on and worked on for 4 years, and she had operated from the beginning on the principle that information relevant to her situation was information she had the right to carry. They were in the canvas pack that had been on the highest shelf of the clay bank since October of 1889, rolled inside the oilcloth underneath the spare lantern in the winter blanket. She had not looked at them since the first month. She had been carrying them as insurance without knowing precisely what they insured against. Now she knew. She took the pack down and unwrapped the oilcloth on the plank floor in the light of 2 lanterns. 7 documents, deed transfers going back to 1851, property tax records, a letter from the original land office establishing the Holt claim in 1849, and the 1847 survey document, the original on paper that had gone brown and soft at the edges with 40-plus years of Missouri humidity, the ink still legible, the boundary notations still precise in the careful hand of a surveyor who had understood his job and done it exactly as far as the job's definition required. She laid the survey document flat on the floor and weighted the corners with stones and looked at it in the lantern light. The north boundary of the Holt property ran along the ridge line above the ravine. The east boundary ran along the fence line. The measurements were in chains and links the standard units of 1847, and she converted them in the margin of her account book to feet, working through the arithmetic twice to confirm the result. The ravine floor from the point where it passed under the north fence to the point where it widened into the creek at the south end was a strip of ground approximately 1,200 feet long and averaging 60 feet wide at the floor. 1.2 acres. It was bounded on all sides by land that was recorded and deeded and surveyed. But it was not itself recorded, not itself deeded, not itself surveyed. It was a blank in the record that had been blank since the record began in 1847, because the man doing the surveying had not gone down into it. She sat on the plank floor of the room she had built inside that blank space, and she looked at the survey document for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil and began to write the homestead filing in her account book in the formal language she had memorized from the Missouri Revised Statutes and confirmed against the federal statute language so that she would have it exactly right when she went to the land office, and there would be no hesitation and no approximation. She wrote it 3 times until the language was exactly right, until every boundary description matched the survey notations exactly, until every legal element the statute required was present and correctly stated. I, Maren Voss, a citizen of the United States, single woman, age 54 years, do hereby apply to enter under Section 2289 of the Revised Statutes of the United States as amended the following tract of land. She described the boundaries, the north fence line of the Holt land, as recorded in the 1847 survey, the creek line at the south, the limestone walls of the ravine on the east and west, the limestone outcrop at the north end, where the cut narrowed to nothing. 1.2 acres, improved by the construction of a habitable structure, a cultivated kitchen garden of approximately 1/4 acre, water management and collection works in continuous residence for a period of 3 years and 4 months, as documented by daily account. She wrote it 3 times until it was exactly right. Then she waited for March. She had chosen March for the same reason she had chosen everything else about the time in the ravine, which was that March was the right time. She had spent 2 weeks in January and February studying the county land office in Millhaven's schedule of operations, confirmed through the legal notice section of the Crossfield paper. The office opened at 8 in the morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thursdays were quieter than Tuesdays. The 60-mile ride would take 2 days, which meant leaving Tuesday morning and arriving Wednesday evening, staying at the boarding house she had identified on her October visit, and presenting herself at the land office when it opened Thursday morning. She would be the first through the door. She spent the last 2 weeks of February in the ravine doing what she had done when she first arrived: preparation. Not the preparation of someone beginning something, the preparation of someone finishing something and beginning something else. She cut 2 extra cords of wood and stacked them along the east wall under the overhang where they would stay dry. She cleaned the stove and checked the chimney channel, reaching back into the clay with a long, straight stick wrapped in cloth to clear any accumulation. The channel was clean, running clear all 12 feet to the turn in the limestone above. She inspected the front wall, pressing each course from bottom to top with her hands and her full weight, the same way she had tested them when she built them. Nothing moved. 3 winters, 3 spring melts, and the wall had settled into itself the way good dry stack settles, becoming more fixed with time rather than less, the friction at each contact point increasing as the weight above compressed and stabilized. She inspected the floor. She had replaced 2 planks in the second winter, where the grain had checked badly in the deepest cold, and the replacement planks had held through the 2 winters since. The rest of the floor was as solid as the day she had laid it. The clay beneath it was dry and dense. The limestone beneath the clay had not shifted. She looked at the room the way you look at something you have built and lived in long enough that you no longer see it as a construction. You see it as a fact. The floor she had split from oak deadfall with Thomas Voss's adze in 17 days of work in October of 1889. The shelves cut into clay that had been undisturbed since before the county had a courthouse. The stove carried in a saddlebag 20 miles and set in a recess she had measured before she bought it. The chimney that had run clean for 3.5 years without once producing a smoke plume visible from the property road above. She had built all of it with $41 in an adze and knowledge taken from a book the Holt family had never bothered to open. She thought about Aldous Holt at the parlor window on the morning she left, the particular quality of his satisfaction. How small a version of the situation he had been looking at from where he stood, with what he knew and what he had never bothered to learn. She did not feel contempt for him. Contempt requires a kind of continuing engagement that she had long since stopped having. She felt something more neutral and more final, the feeling of a ledger that has been settled. Not triumphantly, simply accurately, according to what was actually true rather than what he had assumed was true. The ledger of the situation had always been going to settle this way because the situation had always contained these facts. He had not read the facts carefully enough. She had. She banked the stove. She laid her bedroll out for the last time on the plank platform she had built on stone legs 18 inches off the floor. In the first winter, the platform that had kept her above the ground cold for 3 years, and that would outlast her time in this space by as many years as the limestone above it. She went to sleep in the room that was going to become in law, as well as in fact, and in her own understanding of what she had done here her own. She left on a Tuesday morning in March of 1893. The horse, the adze wrapped in its burlap tied across the back of the saddle, the account book in the top of the canvas pack where she could reach it without unpacking. $112 in the lining of a new coat she had sewn herself over the winter, using fabric she had purchased on her last trip to the mill edge of Crossfield, and sewn in the evenings by lantern light, the lining stitched with the same care she gave to work she would send out under her name. She had measured the money before she sewed it in, and she knew the weight of it by feel without counting. She took the canvas door panel down and folded it and put it in the pack. She took the 7 Holt documents from the oilcloth and put them in the inside pocket of the coat, where she could reach them without opening the pack. She looked at the room for a moment from the doorway. Then she climbed the ravine path and untied the horse from the tree above the rim and rode south. She did not look back at the ravine. She did not need to. She was not leaving. She was going to do something, and then she was coming back. The county land office in Hargrove opened at 8 on Thursday morning. She was there at 5 minutes before 8, standing on the courthouse steps, with the cold March air coming off the ridge to the west and the town waking up around her in the particular slow way of a county seat on a Thursday morning, without the urgency of market day and without the official business that filled Tuesdays. She was the first person through the door. The clerk was a man in his 40s named Waverly, deliberate and precise in the way of someone who has handled legal documents for long enough to understand that the documents will outlast everyone in the room and should be treated accordingly. He had gray at his temples and the particular posture of a man who sits at a desk for most of his working life and has made his peace with it. She placed the Homestead application on his counter. She placed the 7 Holt documents beside it in the order that she had organized them: deed transfers first, then the property tax records, then the land office letter, then the 1847 survey document in the center where he could compare it against the boundary descriptions in her filing. She placed her account book last in front of everything else. Waverly looked at the arrangement. He looked at the application. He looked at the survey. He picked up the 1847 survey document and held it toward the light from the east window, reading the boundary notations carefully, then looking at the boundary description in her application, then back at the survey. He said, "You've done the boundary notation from the 1847 document." She said, "Yes." He said, "This parcel isn't included in any recorded deed." She said, "No, it isn't." He looked at her. He was not suspicious. He was a man processing a legal situation and determining whether all the elements required by the statute were present and correctly documented, the way she would look at a garment to determine whether all the seams were sound and the construction complete before she called it finished and put her name to it. He said, "You've been resident on this parcel for how long?" She said, 3 years and 4 months. "I have a daily account in this book from the first day of residence. Construction records, maintenance records, income records from work conducted on the property, and daily inspection notes." She pushed the account book across the counter toward him. He opened it. He read the first page, which was the construction notes from October 1889, the wall dimensions and the stone counts and the draft test results and the stove installation date. He turned several pages and read the inspection notes in the right column, the brief factual entries that marked each day's observation of the structure's condition. He read the income records in the left column, the Tuesday earnings and the Friday deliveries, and then the entries that were not income, the writing she had done in the long winter of 1891, the thinking set down in the same column where the money had been. He turned to the last written page, which said March 1893. Stove banked, walls sound, floor holding, ready. He closed the book and slid it back across the counter. He said the filing fee is $14. She opened the coat and reached into the inner pocket and counted $14 from the folded money there, counting it onto the counter in a deliberate sequence the way she counted everything. He stamped the application with the date stamp and the office seal. He wrote the parcel description into the registry ledger in his precise hand, the same hand she imagined on all the documents in this office, the hand that would outlast everyone in the room. He handed her a receipt, a carbon copy of the filed application, with the date stamped across the top and his signature at the bottom. She folded it and placed it in the inner pocket of the coat where the Holt documents had been. She said, "How long until the claim is confirmed?" He said, 5 years from the filing date, assuming continuous residence and improvement. "Given what you've filed, I'd call it a formality rather than a question." She thanked him. She left. She stood on the courthouse steps in Hargrove in the March air, with the receipt in her coat pocket and the horse tied at the rail below, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not the drama of it, the fact of it, a legal document with her name on it, filed in a public record, describing a piece of ground that she had found and built on and lived in and learned across 3 years and 4 months, and which was now in the language of the law that had governed every piece of land she had ever lived on in the process of becoming hers. Not given to her, not left to her, not taken from her, not managed for her by a man whose name appeared on the deed. Hers because she had done the work the law required and read the law carefully enough to know what that work was and completed it to a standard that a county land office clerk with 40 years of institutional knowledge had looked at and called a formality rather than a question. She rode north, not to Crossfield, not to Springfield and Harriet's spare room. North on the property road that ran past the Holt fence line, now the Burwell fence line, now just a fence line that ran alongside a piece of ground whose filing was in the county registry under the name Maren Voss. Harriet's spare room in Springfield would keep. It had kept this long. Maren was not the kind of woman who left a place before she was finished with it, and she was not finished here. She had filed a claim. The claim required 5 years of continuous residence. She had 3 years and 4 months behind her. She had 1 year and 8 months in front of her, and she intended to be present for all of them. She tied the horse above the ravine rim. She climbed down the path, the same path she had worn into the ravine wall, over 3.5 years of daily use, every stone of it familiar under her feet. She stood in the doorway of the room she had built, and she looked at the plank floor and the clay shelves and the firebox recess and the front wall of limestone she had set stone by stone in 5 courses in October of 1889. She was home. Not in the way she had been home here in the years of careful concealment, sleeping in a place that required management and vigilance. The ads within reach, the canvas door panel pulled against the wind and against the possibility of discovery. In the way she was home, now standing in a room described in a legal document, filed in a public registry on ground, with her name in the process of being formally attached to it, with nothing to hide from and nothing to wait for and nowhere else she was supposed to be. She had built it herself. She had held it herself. She had claimed it herself. Nobody had given her 3 days and a horse and expected her to disappear. They had given her 3 days and a horse, and she had used them and the 9 months of preparation before them and the 3.5 years of work after them to do exactly what the law allowed a woman in her situation to do. She had read the documents they had kept in their library without reading. She had walked the land they had owned without walking. She had understood the legal framework they had operated inside without understanding. And she had done all of this while they were looking somewhere else, because people who have always had things find it easy to stop paying attention to the things they have, and people who have never been given anything learn to pay attention to everything. She went inside. She lit the stove. She sat down on the plank floor with her back against the east wall and her hands in her lap, and she let the room be what it was, which was hers. Otis Crane found the notice on a Thursday in May. He was doing a spring inspection of the Burwell property, working from south to north, in his usual methodical sequence, walking the field boundaries in the mud of the early thaw, checking the fence posts for winter damage, noting what needed repair in his inspection book. He came up the north fence line to check the corner posts where the north fence met the east boundary, the hinge point of the property's north edge, and he found a wooden stake driven into the ground at the ravine rim with a legal notice nailed to it. He was a methodical man, and he read it from the top. He read it to the bottom. He stood with it for a moment, and then he read it again. He stood at the ravine rim for a long time after he finished reading. Then he looked down into the ravine for the first time in 2 years of inspections, and he saw the front wall of limestone at the base of the overhang, fitted stone on stone, in 5 courses with a framed doorway, and through the doorway the plank floor visible in the interior light, and on the shelves cut into the clay bank, the lantern and the supplies and the account book on the middle shelf, and the woman sitting on the floor with her back against the east wall, her hands in her lap looking back up at him with the calm and prepared attention of a person who has been expecting this particular moment and has decided in advance with considerable care how she intends to meet it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "How long?" She said, 3 years and 4 months. As of the filing date. He looked at the notice again. He was reading it for the 3rd time. She could see, working through the legal language with the attention of a man who does not act until he understands what he is looking at. He said, "I'll need to send word to Mr. Burwell." She said, "I expect so." He said, "There's nothing he can do, is there?" It was not quite a question. She said, "The ravine was never in his deed. It was never in the Holt deed before his. I have the original 1847 survey if he wants to examine it. The filing date is the 14th of March. The parcel is in the county registry under my name. Otis Crane looked at the notice one more time. He folded it and placed it in his coat pocket, and she thought for a moment he intended to take it, but then he unfolded it and put it back on the stake, pressing it flat against the wood with his palm, smoothing it carefully as though he understood that it should remain where it had been placed, and that removing it would not change anything the notice described. He looked down at her for a moment longer. He said, "Stable condition." She said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "I wrote my inspection report 2 years ago. Section of old limestone dry stacking in the North Ravine. Possible old livestock shelter. Stable condition. No action required." She looked at him. He said, "I'll tell Mr. Burwell the filing is legally sound. That's all I can tell him, because that's all I know." He walked back down the fence line south along the route. He always walked his inspection book under his arm, his horse patient at the south gate where he had left it. She watched him until he reached the gate and mounted and rode south toward the house in the fields in the 40 acres of river bottom that Silas Burwell owned, and that would produce what it produced this year and every year managed correctly as it had always been managed. She went inside. She sat down on the plank floor and picked up the account book from the middle shelf and opened it to the last blank page. She wrote May 1893. Filing confirmed in the field. Otis Crane, property manager for Burwell. Methodical, reads legal documents carefully, understands what he can and cannot do. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line beneath it, the last entry in the account book she had begun on the kitchen table of the Holt farmhouse in January of 1889. The book that had carried the plan and the construction notes and the money records and the inspection reports and the thinking she had done in the long winter, when she had needed to think and had no one to think alongside her. She wrote they gave her 3 days and a horse and thought that was enough to erase a person. They forgot that the person in question had read their survey documents more carefully than they had and had spent 3.5 years learning the ground those documents failed to describe. The name on the filing is Marin Voss. It was always Marin Voss. She closed the book and put it back on the middle shelf where it had always been. Outside, the creek was running high with the May melt clear and cold from the limestone springs upstream, moving with the confidence of water that has been running in the same channel for longer than anyone can accurately calculate, and sees no reason to change course now. The ravine walls rose 12 feet on either side, the limestone pale and solid in the spring light. The oaks on the rim were fully leafed, the new growth, that pale particular green of May, that will deepen through summer and turn in autumn and fall and come back again reliably without being asked. The roots threaded down through the clay the way they always had, slow and deep and entirely indifferent to what happened above them, to who owned what, and who had decided what, and who had thought they were resolving a problem and found out later that they had not understood the problem at all. Marin Voss sat in the room she had built and listened to the water and felt the warmth in the clay walls that had been building since March, taking in the days and holding them the way it had always held them, steadily and without drama, giving back what it had been given. She was in the full and legal and uncontestable meaning of the word home.